The red wolf is listed as an endangered species. And generally speaking, under the Endangered Species Act, take of an endangered species is prohibited. You can't harm, harass, kill, or attempt to harm, harass, kill an endangered species. But under Section 10J of the Act, it allows us to write special rules for endangered species, populations of an endangered species that we're reintroducing. And that was done for just exactly that purpose, that reintroduction of endangered species, particularly an endangered predator, can cause a lot of concern in the local community, in the affected area. The Section 10J was written explicitly to allow us to tailor the protections for that population, to try to address and ease the concerns of the community, to facilitate these reintroductions, which for a species like the red wolf, which is extinct in the wild, is essential to its conservation.
There are provisions of the Endangered Species Act that provide for the introduction of species that are endangered to try to reestablish those populations in the wild. Those are typically referred to as experimental populations, and then a determination is made whether that experimental population is essential or not essential to the continued existence of the species.
Because of the captive breeding program was in good shape, the population that was released in northeastern North Carolina on the Albemarle Peninsula was considered to be a non-essential experimental population. And that's important because of the 10J rules and that provision, and to be able to allow flexibility by considering it to be a threatened species.
So under Section 10J, you write a rule and an endangered species is considered or treated as if it were listed as a threatened species. Threatened species do not receive the same protections under the Act as endangered species. And so we write into the 10J rule the specific protections, management measures, other actions that are needed to manage that population.
The experimental population designation under the Endangered Species Act gives some flexibility to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It reduces some of the restrictions that would otherwise apply to the public, but it still is intended to provide for the recovery of the species. So for example, with the red wolf in eastern North Carolina, the full take provisions apply to that species. So people cannot capture, injure, kill, hunt, harm, or even harass those animals unless they meet one of the limited specified exceptions provided for specifically in the federal regulations.
So what kind of implications does that have or hold for stakeholders living in the 5-county area in North Carolina?
There are various protections that are provided by the Endangered Species Act to this population. In general, in terms of legal protection, it receives full protection of the Act when it's on federal land. When it's off federal land, on private lands, there's a lesser degree of protection that's afforded by the Act because of this flexibility of it being an experimental and non-essential population. But the Act has written into it some lessening of the overall requirements in cases where wolves, although there's no documented case of this, may be threatening a person or in the act of taking livestock, for example. Back
in the 1980s, I think Congress had a lot of foresight to look at it and amend the Endangered Species Act to incorporate some flexibility to the Fish and Wildlife Service and in their introduction efforts to try to boost recovery. And in this particular case, they saw that, particularly with predators, that to get landowner buy-in and support for an introduction as an experimental population to try to boost recovery, that there would need to be flexibility in the rules, particularly as it relates to take of those animals. and protection of property and things like that.